Hello, this is Harriet Fraad with the podcast Capitalism Hits Home. It's a show about the intersections and mutual shapings of capitalism, personal life, political life, economic life, and all the aspects of our personal and political and economic lives that shape one another. And the reason the show exists is because people usually leave out the personal, which is how we experience everything. And so I think it's important to include it. It is brought together and helped by Democracy at Work. Anyone can find Democracy at Work on the internet. And there you can find our podcast as well, Capitalism Hits Home. Today, I want to talk about what they call the labor shortage. They say there's a labor shortage. There are 9.2 million people that don't really want to take open jobs, those 9.2 million open jobs. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party differ about what to do about this. Democrats generally say, well, look, you've got to pay people more if you want them to work. The Republicans generally say, well, stop the $300 increase in unemployment benefits and they'll be forced back to work or they'll starve. And so, and they attribute, the Republicans say they're just lazy. Democrats say they're underpaid. Why should they go back? And so this is a debate that rages. There's actually really no labor shortage. There's a protection shortage. There's a payment shortage to workers. There's a shortage in opportunities to have a future. There's a shortage in terms of keeping up with inflation. And so that we have to look at these things to figure this out. Because capitalist America is in big trouble. They're very angry that workers won't come back. And why won't they? What's happened? Why are wages so very low, particularly in the hospitality industry? They want people to come back and work as waitresses. The minimum wage for a waitress is $2.13 an hour because they assume that a waitress or a waiter will get tips. And that's often the case. However, they may not make up the difference even to a minimum wage. Plus, the boss often takes part of the tip. People put it on their MasterCard, and the boss doesn't report the whole tip. So that people are making below the inadequate minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, on which one could barely make you could make less than $300 a week, a little less than $300 a week. And if you look at what's going on, why this is coming up at all, 44% of American workers are low-paid workers. That means that they get somewhere between $7.25 an hour or $15 an hour. Their wages have gone up 3.3% between 1979 and 2020. At the same time as the pay for CEOs has gone up 940% during that time. The pay for the top managers right under the CEOs has gone up 1,000 times since then. The payment for other highly paid intellect workers, for example, in the STEM fields, science, engineering, math, and technology have gone up 63.3%. So 3.3% raise? And what does that mean, a 3.3% increase? At the same time as rents have risen in the double digits, between 10 and 90%. meaning that two workers who work full-time, minimum wage, can't find an apartment with 2 bedrooms in any state, city, or county in the United States. So you can see why workers are not very motivated to come back into lower paid jobs. In addition, there are psychological factors. One is a sense of betrayal. In New York, there was a ticker tape parade for essential workers. And those are people who work in food and bringing food, delivering food. Well, those workers get paid terribly. Walmart is America's biggest employer, sells a lot of food. And although they make a big publicity that they now will pay $15 an hour, in the first place, once the Walmart is closed, many workers at Walmart have to put in unpaid hours bleaching the place and cleaning it. The second is they are working towards a part-time workforce so that people will get much less money. While they publicize that they pay $15 an hour, people, instead of working 40 hours, are working 20 or 30. And they are America's biggest employer. The only food chain that pays more of a living wage with some benefits is Trader Joe's, which is a German company, interestingly enough. At the same time, what has happened that has allowed 44% of our workers to be basically unable to live on the wages they get is that unions have been badly hurt. They've gone down. 1 in 10 workers was unionized in 1970. Now it's less than 1 in 5. What happened there? Well, what happened goes back to an important story that I think we need to learn, which is that there was a sea change after World War II. When FDR was in power and millions of Americans were mobilized in marches of the unemployed down city streets, in actions hanging judges that condemned family farms, in combat in farm areas with the Iowa militias, in job actions of every kind. And FDR came in and basically taxed the top 96.8% of their wages and of their huge inflated salaries. He could get away with that because he could point to the hundreds of thousands of people mobilized, in fact, millions mobilized, and say, if you don't allow that, they will take over. And they would take over because hundreds of thousands, if not millions, actually millions of Americans were organized into actions by the Communist Party, by the Socialist parties, there were 2 of them, and by the CIO, a huge, powerful labor union, the biggest ever, which was organized with a lot of energy and ideological push from the Communist Party and the Socialist parties. After World War II, the capitalists wanted to reassert their might. After FDR died, they found a way that they could do that. Anti-communism. Joseph McCarthy was a congressman who started with the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Before that, he had been on the Housing Committee. He's one of the reasons that the suburbs were given money, but the cities were not, because he felt that city dwellings like apartments that shared washing machines and shared entryways and shared walking space were communists, that anything where people join together and share is part of a communist plot. We also have to remember that during World War II, our biggest ally was the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was referred to as Uncle Joe in the newspapers of that time. And 1 in 4 families had an active communist. In fact, the slogan of the Communist Party at that time was, "Communism is the new Americanism." Something had to be done because the people at the top were losing control. FDR created unemployment insurance. He created the WPA, where he hired people directly, not through corporations that would profiteer off of them, but as government workers, and the Civilian Conservation Corps that built roads and bridges and dams. He employed 11 million people, which for our population, it would be about 22 million. If Biden didn't go through big construction companies and other corporations, but directly government hired well-paid workers to rebuild our society, our infrastructure, and our bridges and tunnels and so on, the externals. That would be a very different story. And so the people at the top were obviously upset about this. And they, with the big help of anti-communism, created an environment in which to be in the Communist Party was basically to want to overthrow the United States government, even though that was never stated in any of the Communist Party materials in the United States. It's ironic that the goal of the January 6th insurrectionists was to overthrow Biden's government, but they have not been tried for treason or deported or jailed or lost their jobs the way that people in the Communist Party did in the 50s. And what had happened was that the Communist Party was very active in organizing in unions, and so were the 2 socialist parties, because the idea of a communist party or socialist parties is that the people who do the work should get the benefits. And so that a union is a way of forcing the boss to share the benefits of the people who created those benefits, the workers, with the workers. And Murray, who was the head of the Central Labor Council, cooperated with the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they threw all the socialists and communists out of the unions, and they were the spark of the unions. They were the most militant unionists. So part of the reason that 44% of our workers have only gotten a 3.3% increase between 1979 and 2020, while the CEOs got almost 1,000% and the top managers did, and why they are struggling and don't want to enter dead-end, low-waged jobs, is because the spark left the union movement. And unions became uninteresting to the mass of people because they didn't deliver. They weren't a movement. They weren't inspired by the ideals of workers creating wealth and then having the wealth they created, or at least sharing the wealth they created. And the anti-communism that swept the nation totally damaged the unions to the point where they're weak. So that part of what happened to keep wages low was that they exported well-paid union jobs. They were outsourced because our American unions didn't fight it. By the way, neither German nor any of the Scandinavian countries, nor Finland nor Iceland allow outsourcing. So they don't have this problem, but our unions didn't force that. And so another cause of people's immiseration with a 3.3% rise in wages as rents doubled, as energy costs went up 24%. And just in the last year, the inflation rate was 5.4%, which meant that they got a loss. That was allowed because they used anti-communism to crush the unions in the militancy of the unions, and to also crush the socialist and communist parties, which were a critical presence standing up for workers. So that's part of what's gone down here. And another part of what's going down here is that as the unions ebbed, and as the ideology of unionism, collectivism, and good pay for workers diminished, there was a very easy flow, as there is now. People went from being CEOs to being and corporate executives into the government. And it was accepted that if you're wealthy, you're really more worthwhile, and that your net worth has a lot to do with your worth in general and your self-worth. And so that America became much more of a land of dollars, in which that 44% of low-paid workers lost every year because of inflation. And then the pandemic came along. And there was an additional irony that at the same time as there was a ticker tape parade in New York, and there was praise all over the place for the essential workers, like the food workers, and the people who deliver our food, and their wages didn't go up. Their jobs became dangerous. People at Walmart, America's biggest employer, generally now, because they work part-time, get less than $15 an hour. They even have, in almost every Walmart, they have a special desk where their employees can apply and get help getting food stamps because they need them, because they get such inadequate wages. I really do think that one of the reasons that the Amazon workers lost their bid to unionize in Alabama, whereas the Amazon workers all over Europe are unionized and get paid better, but in Alabama they didn't. They didn't win the union because the culture of unionism, the left that's there, championing the people who do the work, wasn't present. It was erased. It isn't even in the history books that in Alabama and Mississippi, the tenant farmers union of blacks and whites together fought for the rights of tenant farmers, organized by the Communist Party. There's a very good book called Hammer and Hoe that talks about that union effort, which is not part of our history books, just like the idea of the Iowa militias, who hung judges who condemned family farms and made sure no one paid more than $1 when farms were auctioned off and farm implements were auctioned off. That's not part of our history books either. That whole part of America was repressed. And so that Americans are not unionized, are not in touch with our history of struggle, and so they've been able to get away with lowering our salaries. Now, with that has come another blow to the 44% of people at the bottom. Many of those people championed Obama. They believed in hope and change. Particularly young people were inspired. And what they got was debt and despair. Because under Obama, in 2008, the banks were paid, but not the people who lost their homes, not the people whose credit engulfed them. And things became even more unequal. It was Obama who, at his command, wrecked every single Occupy across this country. And the Occupy movement was the first time that class was reintroduced since the 1950s. It was the 1% and the 99% that became immediately part of America's consciousness because it reintroduced what class is all about. Who owns it and who gets the proceeds and who works for a living and isn't paid well. That plus the ego blow of being called essential and celebrated while being paid minimum wage and considered unskilled and not very important on the job was another ego blow that forced Americans to rethink, do I want to work at a dead-end job? Do I want to work where I can't go to school? And to maybe even think about, wait a minute, we're supposed to be this rich country, the greatest, the greatest, the greatest, the greatest, the greatest, as Trump says, but we're the only advanced, developed country where we don't have free quality health care. Even a poorer country like Portugal, with which most Americans are unfamiliar because for the last many years, they keep electing the same government, a unity of the Green Party, the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party. And they have free education, free childcare, and not only free childcare, quality childcare from 0 to 6 when school starts. They have an anti-addiction program that is amazing. When the dictator Salazar fell, 1 in 10 Portuguese people had an addiction problem, and heroin was rampant. They legalized drugs. This green, socialist, communist government has legalized all drugs, and the government is the one that sells drugs. And with the money they get from selling drugs, they run an amazing anti-drug program where if you want to, when you're buying your drugs, they don't coerce you, but they give you the option of getting off of drugs if you want, and all the support and rehab that you need. In the United States, rehabs often cost about $10,000 a week and are not well regulated, and people die there. And if they run away, they're forgotten. It's a scandal. But in Portugal, they've reduced addiction by 75%, and it's free. And although Americans aren't familiar with the fact that we are at the bottom of the heap in terms of maternity benefits, paternity benefits, free vacations, paid leaves, universal free quality child care, and education on every level, that we are hurting. Americans may not know those stats, but we are at the bottom. We don't offer those things, which make life livable for people who aren't paid as much because so many of their expenses are absorbed. And so that's what happened. And what did it mean to Americans that they were saddled with debt and despair instead of the exciting hope and change that Obama promised, it meant that they might have reevaluated those 9.2 million people. Do I want to go back into a dead-end job where all I'll get is minimum wage or 15 cents more after I've worked for 5 years? What about education benefits? What about childcare? I'll be lost there. I don't want to do that. And so they went into other things, whatever they could, to cobble money together. And the psychological effect of being touted as essential and important and being treated terribly economically. In New York, the Liveristas Unidos, the delivery workers that deliver food from restaurants to people's homes or from supermarkets, were not even allowed to use the bathrooms at the places that were central from whom they delivered food, like the restaurants. But they joined a union. They have a union, not an AFL-CIO union, but their own union, and now have some of those privileges and are getting better wages. America is waking up and starting to realize, because of the terrible mishandling of this pandemic, we have only 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's deaths from COVID, and no public health care, and also a recession. People are starting to say no. And they're starting to unite together. There are more strikes this year than any other year since 2001, in the last 20 years. Because people are realizing what we have, we keep this place going. We are essential, and we're not paid a living wage. We can't live on what we get. And we have a right to stand together and make changes. Even in the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka, who was the head of it for a long time and kept a very conservative policy, when Sarah Nelson suggested that there be general strikes over people being forced to work in airports and not being paid properly, he refused. But he's dead, and hopefully he will be replaced by someone like Sarah Nelson, a militant. And it is interesting that the two most militant unions now are women's unions. It's a time of women's assertion and of women workers. Nurses United and the Flight Attendants Union, with Sarah Nelson at its head. And they are demanding, as are the teachers, they are demanding better working conditions, because America is changing. And those 9.2 million workers won't come back unless they are offered tuition, which they're starting to do at Starbucks. Workers are already catching on. They're demanding tuition reimbursement or tuition payment. And people are leaving jobs that don't have tuition payment. So they've left places like Walmart, and they've joined places like Trader Joe or Costco or Starbucks, which began now offering tuition and health care and mental health care, because they've had to in order to get employees. So that there is a sea change happening that will really help people, because we have to understand that you can't ask 44% of your population to lose money every year while working full-time in unpleasant conditions and often overtime cleaning up your store. And that's why Whole Foods, which is the most expensive grocery, whose essential workers, they made a big celebration that they get $15 an hour. But they cut their hours, so they'll never get paid what they deserve. And this is what's happening. This is what's happening on a psychological level, and on an economic level, and on a political level. And this is why 9.2 million people will not go back to dead-end, low-pay jobs. And we all support them for it, because they are essential. We built this country, and we have to make sure we're treated well. Thank you for listening and watching. And we hope you'll tell your friends to listen and watch. And if you can at all, contribute to our Patreon, which you could find our Patreon at Democracy at Work, Capitalism Hits Home Patreon, where you donate to us, which allow us to continue this program, because we are in a capitalist country and we need help. However, we understand this is not a lucrative time for at least 44% of the population, if not more. And so we love you, whether you donate to us or not, and we hope you listen and tell your friends. Thank you. Goodbye.